Hello everyone. This is the first time I've kind of done something like this, so it's all very surreal. So I'm going to be talking about psychedelic healing from a historical, political, and scientific perspective. And it might just be worth me noting that psychedelic healing isn't limited to drugs, and we can induce these open states naturally, such as through meditation, hypnosis, or breathwork. But for the purpose of today's talk, I will be focusing on drug-induced psychedelic healing, with psychoactive fungi as my focus, due to its growing popularity in the clinical field. So I'm going to start with some historical speculation and address the intrinsic connection we see between spiritual, psychedelic, and healing experiences. I'll then shift into a political and scientific perspective and address how science can accommodate for more holistic approaches to healing. So part one, a historical perspective. And just to make it clear, the next couple of slides will be a play of ideas to lay foundations. So just take it with a pinch of salt. So there's an interesting evolutionary question as to what accounts for our rapid neocortical and socio-cultural development over the 200,000 years. The most accountable answer seems to point to drastic environmental changes, which would have demanded upgrades in mental capacity to ensure survival. But another suggestion, which might or might not have contributed to this, is the repeated ingestion of psychoactive fungi. Now, Terence McKenna, an ethnobotanist who was known for his philosophical thinking, was the first to publicly write about this and coined it the stoned ape hypothesis. And he believed that during these drastic environmental changes, humans were forced out of jungles and across the savannas in search of resources. And it's likely that during the foraging process, they would have come across psychoactive fungi that grows on the top of animal feces. And he believed that at low doses, these mushrooms can induce visual acuity, sexual reproduction, and cooperation. So maybe making for better hunters, higher reproductive success, and more cooperative societies. Now, at higher doses, these mushrooms can induce a thing called synesthesia, which is essentially translating one sensory modality into another. And so language is it's attributing meaning to sound and symbols. So it's inherently synesthetic. And so maybe, being ingested millions of times over thousands of years, psychoactive mushrooms played a role in the reorganization of our primitive brain, allowing for more complicated processes, such as language, to manifest. And so, if psychedelics did play a role in this, perhaps they played a role in the creative explosion 40,000 years ago. This was a time of immense creative fertility, which simultaneously spurred all around the world. And it really marks the birth of symbolism, one of our greatest evolutionary leaps, as we develop this ability to create abstract realities with imagination. And this is indicated in all these cave and wall paintings. Now, having said all this, we are playing with ideas, and we're not going to come to a conclusion as to whether psychedelics had a role in this, but it's fun to speculate nonetheless. So I'm going to now shift onto a slightly more concrete historical perspective, where there's less uncertainty as to whether psychedelics were involved in the human experience or not. Some of the oldest religious artifacts, dating beyond 15,000 BC, speak of psychoactive fungi being sacred for healing and spiritual purposes. You have ancient Sanskrit texts that speak of a brew called 𝗕, which was believed to contain psychoactive fungi, and this was to help them communicate with their gods. You then had the ancient Greeks that spoke of a 𝗕, which was a brew believed to contain ergot, which is an LSD-like alkaloid. And they would use this brew to initiate these secret religious ceremonies, known as the Eleusinian Mysteries. And the idea was that it would help them have a rewarding afterlife and to ensure that life continues to flow freely from generation to generation. And I suppose one could interpret that as maybe an attempt to heal intergenerational trauma, allowing that life to flow freely from your generation to the next. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, you had the Mesoamericans, and in Mesoamerica, you had the Mayans and the Aztecs worshipping psychoactive fungi for divination and healing purposes. And so these are not the only spiritual and religious groups to speak of psychedelic usage, but they are some of the most ancient and just indicate to us how early in human history the psychedelic usage came into the human experience. So there appears to be an intrinsic connection we see between spiritual, psychedelic, and healing experiences. And academics have been attempting to address this. So in the 60s at Harvard, you had Walter Pahnke devising a study with 20 divinity students. So they gave half the participants psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, and the other half had an active placebo. And then they sent them off to church just to see what happens. And they found that all those in the psilocybin group reported significantly greater spiritual and religious experiences. And this was consistent at a 25-year follow-up, providing some empirical support for this intrinsic connection. Fast forward to 2002, and Roland Griffiths and his team at Johns Hopkins were giving a high dose to healthy controls. And from this, they demonstrated that psilocybin can induce mystical experiences associated with substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. About a decade later, they published another study, except giving it to terminally ill patients, in an attempt to try and relieve their anxiety and depression related to death. And they found that 6 months follow-up from that one dose, there was nearly an 80% reduction in anxiety and depression related to their death. And what was also very interesting was that over half the participants reported it to be one of 5 most meaningful experiences of their life, so up there with childbirth and marriage. And this was consistent at a 14-month follow-up. So going forward, I think science should continue to develop a better understanding of this intrinsic link, exploring the therapeutic potential of these mystical experiences and how best to enhance them during psychedelic therapy sessions. So I'm going to now shift on to a more political and scientific perspective, with America as my focus, just because that's currently where I'm situated. So a good place to start would be with Maria Sabina. She's a Mazatec shaman who lived in Mexico until the 90s. Maria was the first to allow Westerners to partake in these mushroom ceremonies. And there was an American named Gordon Wasson that sought her out in hope to participate. And eventually, he was accepted to partake in one of these ceremonies and was so inspired by his experience that he wrote about it in Life magazine in 1957, titled Seeking the Magic Mushroom. And this quickly led to the popularization of these shamanic mushroom ceremonies among Westerners, and led to a huge influx of people seeking Maria out in hope to also participate. And when Maria asked them why they were traveling miles to partake, they would often respond by saying to find God. And this was really what motivated Maria to accept these people, despite causing a lot of controversy in her community. So meanwhile, in Switzerland, LSD had been synthesized by isolating compounds found in a fungus, and it had attracted a large amount of scientific interest. Initially, LSD was the first substance-induced model for psychosis. So instead of giving it to patients, it was actually the therapists that were taking it. And the idea was it induces a transient psychotic episode, to allow the therapists to be able to relate better with their patients, their psychotic patients. But then we kind of realized that it was only resembling aspects of psychosis, and so attention shifted towards patients. And from the 50s to 60s, 40,000 patients were being treated with LSD, with over 1,000 academic journals being published. And so there was two forms of LSD therapy at the time. You had psycholytic therapy, which involves low to medium doses, followed by psychoanalytic therapy, in an attempt to unmask unconscious processes and help the patient relive long-lost memories. You then had psychedelic therapy, which seems to be the more common one nowadays, probably due to feasibility. And that's one high-dose session, followed by psychotherapy. And the idea is it provides the patient with a fresh perspective of their problem at hand, so that you can work through it during the psychotherapy. And both approaches showed effectiveness for a variety of problems, most notably in the addiction literature, but also in the mood and anxiety-related disorders. However, from the 60s to 70s, LSD had leaked from the labs and onto the streets, synergizing with the socio-cultural shift, as young people started questioning conservative culture, materialism, and political norms. This chaotic period threatened the status quo, and government's concerns for LSD grew strong. It was closely associated with student riots and anti-war demonstrations. It was also not very appealing for pharmaceutical industries due to the lack of economic incentive the approach provided. And there was also some concerns for the validity of all this research, with a lot of research lacking control groups, for example, and probably vulnerable to publication bias, whereby they exclude negative data. And so, from the 60s to 70s, the US government gradually pulled funding away, and eventually outlawed it in 1970, classing them as Schedule I, having zero medical value and a high risk of abuse. And it wasn't until the 80s, thanks to the birth of neuroscience, that psychedelic research started gaining interest again. So this brings us to today, an era of psychedelic resurrection among our scientific world. Currently, there's more clinical trials with psychedelics than ever before. In the US specifically, the past 2 years have brought about drastic shifts. The FDA designated psilocybin and MDMA as breakthrough treatments, respectively, for depression and PTSD, meaning these are literally some of the most promising drugs we currently have in development. In 2019, the FDA approved ketamine as a treatment for depression and suicidality. I'm currently working at Feinberg's lab at Yale, where we're replicating this research, except seeing whether it can target suicidality in a population with borderline personality disorder. So it certainly seems like psychedelic research is expanding. And the media seems to be positive. However, we mustn't go overboard like in the 60s. To prevent another shutdown, we must be extremely careful with study designs, regulating research with appropriate ethical considerations. We should also establish solid procedures surrounding the training and facilitation of psychedelic therapy. One example is ensuring 2 therapists are present, male and female. Seems to work relatively well so far. Another point is controlling enthusiasm and orientating towards skepticism and caution. Psychedelics are no panacea to humanity's problems, and certainly not everyone should be taking them. However, at least for some, they can provide insight into a more open and healthier way of being, a way which we can reconnect with through memory more easily afterwards. It's not uncommon for people who have undergone these experiences in the past to turn towards naturalistic means, such as through meditation. And Sam Harris, the neuroscientist and philosopher, who some of you might be aware of, is an example of this. And so it begs the question as to whether these trials should be limited to clinical populations, or whether we should broaden our scope and consider non-clinical populations to maximize healing potential for more people. So other than learning from past mistakes, what else have we gained over the past 80 years which might help prevent another shutdown? And one prominent factor is the internet, something which enhances the spread of knowledge, giving power to the people, and increasing awareness for humanity's problems as a collective. Just take a look at Greta Thunberg and you can see my point clearly. And because of this, we're far more aware of the rising reports of mental suffering. Unfortunately, there's an alarming amount of loneliness in America, with 1/3 of Americans reporting to be seriously lonely, and that's 51% of mothers with young children. Another major issue is addiction, which is digging so deep into our societies at the moment. And it's a conversation which lacks opinion. It's a conversation that is lacking, in my opinion. Fentanyl overdoses are the #1 killer of Americans at the moment, between the ages of 18 to 45, with nearly 80,000 people dying last year. And even the more discrete addictions are rife within our communities, whether that's to social media, prescription drugs, or fast food consumption. We seem to be living in a society that's breeding loneliness and addiction. And for those that are actually seeking treatment for their suffering, 1 out of 3 are offered inadequate treatment, despite some going on for years. So there's certainly some room for improvement regarding our current therapeutic paradigm. And another change influenced by the internet is this rise of spiritual awareness and practice we see among us, especially during the COVID pandemic. If you're not doing yoga, I'm sure someone next to you is, and this has changed drastically in recent years. So moving forward, I think efforts should be in place to reconceptualize spirituality through a scientific lens, because everything we experience can, in fact, be explained without resorting to the supernatural. Take our connection with others and our connection with nature as examples. Science tells us we're social beings, and we're totally dependent on one another. When we cease to live in the mind of others, we suffer detrimentally, whether that's through the manifestation of loneliness or falling victim to addiction. As for our connection with nature, well, we are completely interconnected with it. We're no different from any other species. It's just our ego and our ego's ability to, refuse connection and build walls that prevents us from seeing this clearly. And so we begin to see here the opposite to spirituality could be seen as egotistical. And all spiritual practices try to do is temporarily move us away from this in order to alleviate suffering and generate a sense of well-being, whether that's through the practice of gratitude, meditation, or connecting to nature. By applying a scientific lens to spiritual approaches, we can better understand the healing potential of these egoless practices, with psychedelic research and therapy being the most pressing example currently being implemented across the world. It really marks a new era of clinical treatment as we broaden our scope, viewing human suffering much more holistically, with a lot of emphasis on interpersonal connection, meaning, and experience. So I'm going to finish with an interesting parallel when looking at fungi's role for Earth and psychoactive fungi's role for humans. For Earth, they seem to grow in sentient networks, facilitating communication between trees. They recycle and transmute, absorbing toxins and transforming environments into flourishing ecosystems. Now for humans, they can open our minds up to the acknowledgement that we are part of an ecosystem which is far greater than ourselves. They enhance communication between brain regions which might not have communicated since early development. And they allow our older selves to decompose and transform into a more evolved version of ourselves. In other words, fungi is to the natural world what psilocybin seems to be to the human mind. And thanks for your attention.